All right, so we probably should get started. Thank you again so much for joining us today for our webinar, What the Pandemic Taught Us About Retention. Of course, we're taking our insights from our 2021 retention report, the COVID edition. So glad. My name is Danny Nelms. I'm a president of Work Institute and one of the authors of our report. And I'm excited to have joining me today, Catherine Huddleston, who is our VP of Client Success and Operations. So Catherine, how are you today?
Good, how are you?
Doing well. It's gotten hot here in sunny Tennessee. How are things in Georgia?
About the same. Took a walk after work yesterday and thought I was going to die.
It has gotten hot in the South all of a sudden. Well, we're really excited about our retention report this year. I stated this in the report itself, but obviously the last year and a half has been extraordinarily difficult for so many people around the world. A pandemic is something that we would never wish for, but certainly we've learned a lot from it. And as workforce researchers, we certainly find it fascinating to research behaviors in the workplace. And so being able to take a little bit of a deep dive into how people behaved in the workplace, specifically around retention, was possibly a once in a lifetime opportunity. So we wanted to bring those insights to you. And how do we use those insights going forward? What is it going to teach us about how we retain employees effectively? So I want to start off by just kind of doing a little bit of review of, really what the environment was like last year from a workforce perspective. Obviously, a lot going on. We had unemployment increasing. We had job openings decreasing. We had voluntary quits decreased, and I'll look at those in just a little bit more detail. But we really start off with unemployment, and what we saw was almost 15%, just shy of 15% unemployment in April of last year, and that's really when everything began as we start to look at the effects of the pandemic. And we're going to get into this in a few minutes, but we actually looked at the behaviors in the workplace, and each quarter is distinctly different. And so we're going to look at each of the quarters. We're going to see how things were differently. But as you can see here, it really was in April when the pandemic began to really affect the workforce. And this is kind of a side note, and I'm honest, I threw this little visual in at the bottom at the very last minute. I know our marketing team doesn't like it because it doesn't look pretty, but I took a little bit of liberties here because I know there's also been a lot of talk about unemployment still being right at 6.1%. It actually edged up slightly in April from where it had been in March. And there's just a lot of debate out there in terms of getting people back to work and getting people back off of unemployment. And I thought it was interesting to look at this from a little bit of a historical basis. So what you see in the chart below is unemployment rates going back to 1990. And I think what you see is, we had that little spike around 1992-ish where we had a little bit of high unemployment, certainly nowhere near the level we've got now, but it edged up to close to 8%. And then didn't get down into the 4% range until around 2001. And then we had that next spike around 2003, and it took us a while to recover and get below 5. And then, of course, the Great Recession, we had 10% unemployment, and it took a number of years to get back to that 5% range. Now, obviously, I know that the conditions we faced with the pandemic are extremely different than what really was more economic factors in each of these instances where we see unemployment on the rise. But let's face it, there were economic challenges that came with the pandemic. So I think it may take us a little bit of time to really get that unemployment number where we would like for it to be back to something we would consider full unemployment, and certainly would love to see those historic numbers at 3.5% or so that we were seeing pre-pandemic. But I think we're going to have a little bit of patience, but I think it's also, and we're going to talk about this towards the end, just what are we going to have to do to get employees back into the workplace? The one of the saddest parts of the pandemic was the fact that there were so many employees that were laid off. There were so many industries that were impacted. Everything from hospitality being impacted. We know it from hotels. We know it from certainly from from the travel industry. But there were so many industries that were impacted, and we actually work a lot in healthcare. And although a lot of the hospitals and healthcare systems were busy, you also had a lot of the elective areas with physician practices and even areas of hospitals that were not able to be as busy because of the restrictions around the COVID pandemic. So there were a lot of people that were out of work, and luckily that number has gone down substantially. So we're not seeing the layoffs that we were back last year. And so that's certainly a good sign. Now we've just got to get those unemployed workers back to work. The one thing that we are always focusing on here at Work Institute, and is very much a focus of our retention report, is in fact voluntary turnover. And this is tracked through the quits rate, through the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So they look at the number of people that are leaving their jobs voluntarily. And so this is basically a percentage of the workforce. So it's hovered somewhere between 2 and 2.5% for a number all the way since January of 2018, with just a few little bumps in there. But we saw that number go all the way down to below 1.5%. And just to give you kind of some numbers for that, generally that 2.7% or so equates to about 3.5 million or so employees leaving their job voluntarily. And that number went down to around 1.6 million. So, a little less than half of that when we got down into that 1.8, 1.9 range. What's encouraging, I think, but certainly concerning for employers, is how quickly that voluntary turnover has come back. And by December, we were seeing numbers at about 2.3%, and we've only seen that number rise since January. So we're almost back to where we were pre-pandemic. And so employees are seeing opportunities out there in terms of the number of jobs. The Bureau of Labor Statistics reported that there's about 8.5 million open jobs right now in the U.S. And so we're seeing that there are a lot of opportunities. And so employees are starting to take those opportunities to go work somewhere else. They're going to somewhere where they felt like it was more attractive. And in some cases, it's a little bit of an indictment of their current employer, feeling that they did not provide the best work environment. They didn't provide them the best flexibility. They didn't do things the way they had hoped they would during the pandemic. And so we're seeing at least some of the results of that in terms of people leaving their jobs voluntarily. So that's kind of the environment that we worked under from a U.S. workforce over the last year, basically. It's been very tumultuous, a lot of changes each quarter. And so, we wanted to look at kind of how that impacts the reasons for leaving. And just as a little bit of a precursor, we've changed the order of this several times over the last 5 years. But rather than going right into the reasons for leaving, I think most people are familiar with our approach and how we categorize information. We have 10 categories for reasons for leaving. And then within each of those categories, there are some sub-themes or reason descriptions. And we're going to talk more about those when we get into the individual reasons. But just wanted to take a quick look at kind of how the categories changed over the last 3 years. And so what we've seen, especially in 2020, the real big ones were health and family, not surprising to some degree, but we saw a huge increase in 2020 from what we've seen the past 2 years in terms of people leaving for health and family reasons. And then a little more surprising maybe was just how many people chose to retire. And so we've been talking for a number of years about the fact that we've got a huge population, still kind of those baby boomers that have reached retirement age. And what we found is that at the point where the pandemic was at its most difficult time, we saw a little bit of a spike, but then really towards the end of the year, that's when we saw those retirements really kick in. And so those are the two areas that were big observations. We did see some changes. I didn't circle it, but going back to career, we've seen a little bit of decline in career reasons over the last 3 years. And certainly we think this is a positive thing, but as you can see, it's still by far the number one reason why people leave their jobs. And then we saw total rewards go down. This is not unusual during difficult economic times and during times of high unemployment. You typically see people hunker down a little bit more. We saw that through the fact that there's fewer voluntary terminations, but money doesn't become as critical in those instances, although we would say it's not a critical factor most times, but less people were leaving for that. But then we also saw a little bit of decline in work-life balance. And what we really saw there is the fact that in a lot of cases, for the first time, employers were really focusing on work-life balance, and they were giving employees more flexibility, and they were seeing that they needed to take care of kids at home or family members or other loved ones at home. And so employees have been clamoring for more work-life balance. They've been clamoring for more flexibility. And, you know, I think this can be seen potentially as one of the positives coming out of the pandemic, is just that many employers saw that there are opportunities to allow employees to be more flexible and still get the work done that needs to get done, and make sure that there's high levels of productivity. So those were some of the big trends that we saw over the last 3 years. Now, looking specifically at last year and looking at it specifically by quarter, what we see is that in the case of health and family, we saw that big increase in the second quarter. So immediately as the pandemic was taking hold, as we were seeing new higher numbers of cases of COVID-19 to occur, people were retreating to their homes, either to take care of family members, to get out of risky environments that they felt like could be spreaders of the disease, of the virus. And so we saw that big spike in health and family, and then it kind of returned to a little bit more normal ranges by the end of the year. Obviously, we've already talked about retirement, but we didn't see as much of that occurring in the second quarter. We saw a little bit of a spike, but it was really at the end of the year where we saw an enormous spike in retirements, unlike anything we've seen in the past. We also saw a little bit of that spike in job. And so the job was increasing a little bit. Again, some of this I think just came from a level of frustration. And then it's not unusual to see some of those involuntary terms that went up in the second and third quarter, but then came back down. But we see relocation didn't change a lot. Environment didn't change a lot. It was interesting to me that the manager reasons for leaving came down a little bit during that second quarter, because I would have thought maybe they would have gone up because managers weren't handling the circumstances very well. But we certainly have not seen a lot of evidence to support that. So this is kind of a view of how things change from quarter to quarter. So certainly interesting, certainly some big spikes from here and there, but then in other cases, not any significant changes. In terms of the retirement, one thing that we found that was a little bit interesting was that that men were retiring at a higher level than women. Not sure that we can tell you a whole lot more about that, but we certainly did see it. And then we saw that for career reasons, men were much higher than women in terms of leaving last year. And then health and family, this is where we see that there were more women that were leaving for health and family reasons than there were for men or for males. And so this is something that was kind of interesting to look at, maybe not surprising, but it's always, again, these are some of the interesting factors that we looked at, trying to determine what were the different things that occurred during a pandemic and what we might see under more normal circumstances. One of the things that we've continued to see over the last few years is the first year turnover rate go down. That is one of the data points that we collect We call it turnover. Catherine reminds me on a routine basis that we really can't calculate turnover because what we see are the departures. So what we're really looking here is not necessarily a flat turnover rate, but the percentage of people that are leaving in the first year. And we have seen that go down at the top of 40% in 2017, dropped just a little bit in 2018, a little bit more in 2019, and then took a pretty big dive in 2020. Now, I think some of that is to be expected because, again, you've got a little bit of this hunkering down. When people found jobs, they wanted to stay in those jobs and they didn't want to move around a lot. But I think the challenge for employers is to see if, in fact, we can try and maintain this because, as we've stated many times, some of the most expensive turnover is that early stage turnover. And so there's so little return on investment. So we're hoping to see that employers, in fact, are just improving and it isn't just pandemic related to see if we can, in fact, sustain this lower level of first year departures. When we look at the turnover categories by tenure, a little bit of a non-surprise is that you see that big spike with those that had 10 or more years of tenure. Or length of service actually left at a fairly higher rate for retirement. Again, not that surprising because it seems that most people that have more tenure or more length of service tend to fit into some of those older age categories. And so that was certainly the case. But we didn't see, in everything else in terms of career, for example, again, we saw some of the same things happening, we get a little bit of that, in the middle years, in that sort of 1 to 5 years is where we really see that spike in terms of why people leave for career reasons. And so it's a reminder to us that, and as we get employees into that 1 to 5 year range, that we really need to be talking about their career opportunities and where they want to go and what they want to do and how they want to be developed. And we're going to get into that a little bit more in a few minutes. For health and family, we certainly saw that those people that had less tenure maybe decided to leave at a higher rate. And so they, just quickly made a decision they're going to leave and they're going to take care of their health or take care of their family. We saw a little bit of a spike in early stage with job and then a little bit around the work-life balance as well. So there were some unique differences. I think the only one that really jumps out at us is the retirement, and the other ones sort of had a similar pattern to what we've seen in past years. If we look at age factors, again, we see the retirement, and those 60 and older were certainly the highest percentage of those that left. But then for career reasons, again, we see this decline as people get older. They're leaving less and less for career reasons. So we've really got to focus on those folks in the 20 to 30 year range to make sure that we're fostering the right career opportunities. Health and family kind of stayed, pretty close to the same, around 10 to 12%. And, everything else, relocations certainly go down as people get older. And the work-life balance, typically we see a little bit of a higher number in those age ranges from into 30 to 50. But we saw this year that they actually, all the way back into the 20 to 29 range, we actually saw bigger numbers this year than we had in the past. And so again, I think we look at those things that are important to people: work-life balance, my job, health and family. These are all factors that we're going to have to really pay attention to as we go forward and get into something we might call a little more normalcy. So at this point, we want to kind of pivot and get into a little bit more detail around the reasons for leaving. And this is where Catherine's going to come in and help me out a little bit because Catherine really works closely with a lot of our clients, works closely with a lot of the details. So I'm going to kind of give you the big picture view, and then Catherine's going to comment a little bit on what we see in terms of those reason descriptions or sub-themes, and certainly what we saw over the last year or so. Again, just from a big picture perspective, this was the reasons for leaving in 2020. So the pie chart at the left was the 2020. What we saw at the right was, again, the trend chart that we saw earlier. But I want to point out that for the 11th straight year, career reasons were the #1 reason why people left as a category. And so we'll get into what makes up that category in just a minute, but we see over and over again how important career is to employees. It's one of the things that attracts them to new employers. And so we're seeing a little bit of an improvement, as you can see in the chart on the right. But still, it's got a long way to go in order for us to get this number down to something that's more even with some of the other reasons. Health and family jumped up and was the #2 reason, #2 category, excuse me, as to why people left. Again, maybe not terribly surprising, given the fact that the impact of the pandemic as a whole. But again, we expect that number will go back down here in 2021, but it might not. And a lot of this really depends, I think, on how employers handle the circumstances in front of them and the circumstances facing many of their employees. And then you had kind of an equal distribution between work-life balance, the job itself, retirement, and then manager. And again, the one thing I'm going to point out this year, and we've pointed this out over and over and over again, is that this category of pay, total rewards, is way down the list in terms of why people leave their jobs as a category. There's just so many other factors that influence those decisions to leave their job. So when we look at the career reasons, again, not surprising, everything, there's a little bit of cyclical nature to this if you look at from year to year. But then we didn't see a huge decline in second quarter, but we did see a little bit of a decline. So that number went from around 20% to around 15, 16%. But then we certainly saw it go up in Q3. So as people were starting to see opportunities out there, starting to make decisions, there certainly were decisions being made.
And Danny, just was going to say about Q3, we also, a lot of times I'll see a spike there because you've got the school component, right? So if someone's going back to get an advanced degree, they're on a traditional calendar quarter. Those all hit in usually early Q3.
Great point, Catherine. Catherine, why don't you talk a little bit about these sub-themes that we always talk about and kind of what makes up this category and kind of how they've changed over the last several years?
Sure. So I mean, we can see, development, which we kind of always couch as maybe they're not leaving for a, promotion, because you can see that we have promotion later down in the table, but maybe I'm at the organization and I just don't, I'm happy maybe today, but I really am focused on long-term career growth and I just don't see the opportunity for that. So it's kind of what makes up that development. So we certainly saw that increase as a reason from 2018. Surprising, kind of saw a different career decrease. This would be maybe I'm a teacher and I just decide I don't want to be in education anymore, so I get a job as an accountant. I mean, it could be as extreme as that. Sometimes we'll see it in a healthcare setting. Maybe I was in a hospital setting and I wanted to shift to a doctor's office. So kind of that differing actual type of work. So we saw, that on the decline, but certainly the development and then the direct promotion certainly made up the bulk of that. And I will point out, Danny, you did call out that career has declined, but I'll argue that it's declined because other reasons like the ones you've called out and we'll call out again have gone up. So there were other reasons that some of those people that left for health and family might have left later in the year for career, but they had a more immediate reason for leaving. And then the last thing about career, I just was thinking about it today. I think every single organization I've met with in the last few weeks about their 2020 data is plagued by career. And I keep hearing over and over again that, maybe in the last few years, organizations have started to build more career pathing, more focus on career development and awareness of it. And I've heard time after time last year about how they had to put those plans on hold because we had to react to the crisis at hand. So it's almost like we kind of might have taken a step back, but many are starting to gear back up that focus on some of these, nice to have processes.
Yeah, and I think, and Catherine, I wonder if you would agree with me, but I think a lot of times, and this is why we really trying to get into this level of detail, is when you hear career, I think a lot of people immediately think promotion, that's That's what really makes up this idea of the career reason category. But yeah, it's important. But as you can see, there's things that even are of greater importance than promotion.
Yep, that development could encompass lateral moves. So again, or I saw something, that I was going to maybe do a similar job, but I foresee that this organization can provide me better long-term growth, even if it's not immediate.
Just a quick anecdotal story. I was actually talking to someone not too long ago, and they were talking about, and one of their employees really wanted to go into another department, not for a promotion, but just as a lateral move into another area. And they were just insistent that they couldn't lose this employee, that they just couldn't lose it. They were so valuable, and really blocked them from going into another department where, then you think that they're probably going to make a decision to leave. And I think you probably see those instances a lot in individual client data.
Yeah, I actually just had a conversation with an organization who's working to improve the ease and flexibility of transferring for that exact reason. And part of it then goes back to the manager. And just like your scenario, I've got to educate the manager to say it's better that we keep this great employee, even if you're losing them from your department, because we might be able to get them to transfer and maintain them long term. But if you're forcing them to stay where they don't want to be, they're going to leave anyway. So you might as well help, keep them at the organization. But not every manager, kind of has that mindset and maturity.
100%. And we're going to really look at some interesting data towards the end about what I think the role of the manager really is becoming, and we'll get into why we feel that way. And again, here's the health and family reasons. And so again, not surprising, this is where we saw this large spike in second quarter. And, again, people were looking for safety in a lot of cases. They were looking for, there were so many risk factors involved in being exposed to the virus. They were trying to protect themselves. They were trying to protect children. They were trying to protect other loved ones that might be in the house. And so, this was the category that really changed the most in terms of from quarter to quarter. And Catherine, I don't know that it's overly complicated, but certainly anything that you saw in the sub-themes?
Yeah, I mean, all of the things that you said, and I have seen organizations start to try to put together re-recruitment practices, right? So if someone had to leave in Q2, for childcare, well, now that schools and daycares are back up, and certainly starting late last year, how do you make sure you try to re-engage as you need to backfill positions? Okay.
And by the way, I didn't say this at the outset, but certainly we welcome questions. We'll try and get to them at some point during the presentation. We're trying to move pretty rapidly, but don't hesitate to type in your question into the Q&A section of the webinar, and we will try and get to those. If not during the session, we'll make sure and get to them at the end, as many as we can. Work-life balance reasons. Again, this is one of those interesting factors in that, different things are impacted for different reasons. And certainly when we see economies go down, when we see unemployment go up, we see that people are a little more tolerant, I think, of certain things. And so we saw that those work-life balance reasons went down, but they've kind of stayed down. And this is going to be a really interesting one to watch over the course of the next year to see if, in fact, this is a place where employers have learned how to give people a better, more flexibility. Catherine, are you hearing a lot from clients in terms of, some real learnings that they had during the pandemic of things that they can actually do they didn't think they could do in the past?
Certainly. I mean, you can see here that the commute and work travel certainly were down since 2018. And I'm constantly here. And obviously everyone, or seemingly everyone, had to rapidly switch to a work from home model, and they may or may not have had a plan in place. But I certainly keep hearing about trying to figure out how do I maintain that, because people are getting used to it. They're liking it. Don't quote me on the study. I heard on the radio a couple weeks ago that only 2% of people are excited to come back to work full time. And so, I think they're realizing that they're going to need to have some sort of maintaining flexibility because it's what people are used to now, and most like it.
It's funny, Catherine, because one of the studies I read, or maybe one of the headlines, and I'm not picking on you, but you mentioned coming back to work, and it's like that's actually become something that people have been saying. You shouldn't be saying that. They're coming physically back to the office, but not necessarily coming back to work because people have been working incredibly
True.
hard.
Yep. Yeah, and that's where I think it was interesting that this went down because just anecdotally, just from my experience and my friends and, clients is that people seemingly are working harder than ever. I've worked from home for years, so I have a little bit more regimented about, shutting down when I'm done for the day. But even with COVID, it's like, well, I don't have anything else to do. I'm not going places in the evening, so I might as well just keep my laptop open on the kitchen while I'm cooking dinner. So I would have thought that maybe some of this would have gone up because they felt like they were working longer hours, but clearly, that wasn't the perception.
Agreed. All right. Get things working here again. Obviously, not a lot of detail to go in here. I mean, retirement was just an option for a lot of the baby boomers in particular. So they've taken advantage of this. They took advantage of the timing. They just felt like, the stress, the burnout, the potential to being exposed over a long term to the virus. They just simply made decisions to get out of the workforce. And so this is, I think, one of the challenges that we're going to have is that we're going to continue to try and keep an eye on this in terms of just what is that workforce participation number and see where that goes in terms of are we able to get the participation rates back up to a place where we can have enough people in the workforce to do the work that needs to get done.
I also would attribute, just going back to that spike in Q4, again, anecdotally seeing and from headlines, just other news media, voluntary retirement packages or complete restructures where a subset of that is the voluntary retirement as the dust is starting to settle and organizations are realizing they've got to restructure. So I would attribute some of that spike in the late last year to some of that.
Okay. Catherine, I'm going to pause for just a second. We have had a few questions come in through the chat routine. I'm sorry, I was looking at the Q&A, but I wanted to look at the chat bot. So somebody asked, is career not intrinsically linked to compensation? What do you think about that in terms of what you see? I mean, do you think that they're that closely linked, or do you think in our research and the way we look at them that people are able to separate those or do separate them?
Well, I mean, I think the fact that we see so infrequently compensation being a top reason for leaving. I mean, you always say sometimes it's, you're not paying me enough for the job I'm doing. I'm okay with my pay, but if the job could be restructured or I could get a different manager, I think those are some more of the common pain points. And I think people can recognize, certainly, I mean, if they're going to get a promotion, they're certainly going to expect, a pay raise. But again, that development is just feeling challenged, feeling, like they're constantly growing and not doing the same thing over and over again. I think the data speaks for itself that is clearly what's most important from a driver perspective.
And I mean, I think it is and I'm responding to one of the attendees, Amy, but I mean, yes, maybe it's a little bit of a complicated issue. But, we're researchers, and so we go where the data tells us. And what we've continually seen over the years is that this development issue is generally recognized more regularly than promotion opportunities. Now, I will say that we saw a little bit higher number of promotion opportunities being a big issue as we came out of the 2009 recession. And it kind of makes sense that companies had retreated, companies were shrinking, they weren't expanding quickly, and so employees only saw opportunities to be promoted when they went somewhere else. But we certainly have not seen those kind of numbers over the last several years. All right, in terms of the job itself, so we look at workload stress being, maybe not surprisingly, the number one issue related to the job itself. And we certainly saw a little bit of an increase in job reasons in the latter half of the year. So some things just weren't right with their job. And Catherine, can you talk a little bit about those sub-themes in the job itself?
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, like, as you mentioned, workload stress, availability of resources. I see that sometimes that's a people issue. All right. We don't have enough staff. Sometimes it's I don't have the supplies and equipment I need. Training, obviously pretty cut and dry. And again, you can see that the one of the highest jumps in this group was this characteristics type of work, kind of the work that they're doing every day. I can't tell you how many times I heard early on, you've got somebody in HR who's working, in a hospital and is having to take, patients' temperatures. They're having to do things that aren't their job, right? I was thinking about this morning, and it's like my brother-in-law is a master distiller. He makes vodka. His distillery, he doesn't own it, so he was kind of had to do this, but for weeks, maybe even months, he was making hand sanitizer 7 days a week, 12 hours a day, couldn't get time off. So, I thought about him in this kind of scenario where it's all of a sudden overnight, he went from doing a job that he loved to having to make hand sanitizer. And I saw it again in data. I'm a receptionist, and all of a sudden now I love my job, and now I'm having to take temperatures, go through checklists for anybody that walks in the door. So I think that's where we saw a good increase in that for those kinds of scenarios where they clearly ultimately got frustrated and couldn't handle those changes. For many, it was temporary and they got through it, but certainly that's kind of some color around that type of work.
And I think we're going to talk about this at the end, but I think there's so many intricate pieces of the job itself that sometimes I think managers in particular aren't really looking at it in enough detail or holistically enough. I don't know which way to describe it in terms of how they need to be working with employees to improve the job circumstances. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
And I think we'll get into the manager here in a minute a little bit more.
All right, my apologies. All right, the manager. So obviously around 10% of people actually leave for their manager. Again, I want to point out that, the general sort of perception is that people either leave for money or they leave because of their manager. And I think their manager influences a lot. We're going to get to that, and we're going to have to speed up a little bit. But in terms of manager reasons for leaving, around 10%. So 1 in 10 people leave specifically because of their manager. And we saw those numbers obviously lower in 2020. And not surprisingly, when that voluntary turnover goes down and people hunker down, they're willing to tolerate more for their manager. Have you seen anything else in terms of things we need to think about in the manager category, Catherine?
So I think just this table at the bottom is telling. So Danny and I had kind of a joking, dueling theories of how management was going to shake out as we started to see these scores improve late last year when we did some preliminary analysis. And I said, well, I think it's maybe because they're not dealing with their manager as much, right? There's not as much face-to-face opportunity to be dissatisfied. And he, being a little more optimistic, was hoping managers really stepped up the plate. I think the data here says the decrease in issues with professional behavior. That says to me, well, there's less interaction, so there's less a chance for you to be inappropriate to me. Knowledge and skills, I'm going out on a limb, but maybe I'm not collaborating with you as much because you're at home. I'm here, and so I'm doing more work on my own, and maybe I'm not as frustrated with, my manager's lack of knowledge or skills. But then we see here an increase in reasons for leaving for communication. So are they not communicating as much as they should because people are leaving at a higher rate for the quality of the manager's communication?
Yeah, and I've got some interesting things I want to point out, Catherine, towards the end, and we'll certainly get to that. But again,
I will say, anecdotally, when I look at an individual client with them and their manager scores are going up, more often than not, they're surprised. Every now and then someone says, yep, we felt the same way, we felt them stand up, but especially the larger the organization, they're quite shocked when they see manager scores improved.
All right, again, total rewards, and I don't think we need to get into a lot of detail here. Again, very predictable that when we have tougher unemployment circumstances, tougher economies, people don't leave for money, although they generally don't leave for money at all. But that's, certainly went down. So I don't want to get into a lot of detail here. Benefits is such a small percentage of the overall reason that it really is about pay generally when someone leaves. Involuntary obviously is pretty obvious in terms of the increases that we saw over the quarters. So involuntary reasons, are pretty self-explanatory. So I want to get into something real quick here, and we're going to wrap this up in about 5 minutes. But one of the things that we've been doing here at Work Institute over the last several years is the reason for leaving is not the only data that we collect in an exit interview. We're actually collecting perceptions around a variety of things. Four of those being the job itself, the team, the manager, and the organization as an employer. And so we use these, we call them our core drivers, and we're really using those to look at them both as retention efforts and how we can improve these ratings to improve retention. But we're going to see in just a minute, we're actually able to use these as a predictive analytic. And what we saw is that the average manager rating actually went up pretty substantially last year. And Catherine, that's the point you were making, is that we have sort of two different opinions about this. You tend to think out of sight, out of mind, so to speak. And I want to think that the managers actually stepped up. We're actually going to be producing a little bit more research on this, hopefully this summer. We've got some additional data that we can dig into. There's just always limited time as we're trying to put our report together. So I want to let everybody know to be on the lookout. That we expect to dig into this a little bit deeper and see if we can help, the general public understand how these reasons improve. I looked at it a little bit, and again, that communication is a big part of it, but in terms of the organization and employer, a lot of environmental factors really played into that. And so we're going to be able to give you a little bit of color around this. So not a lot of a story here other than it has improved. The question is, can we keep it improved? Because this is the other thing that we've done. So we finally had enough data to actually look at, can those core drivers predict reasons for leaving or predict the categories for reason? And what we see is that the manager rating actually routinely predicts the reason for leaving categories in 6 different categories: the career, the environment, the involves, the job, the manager themselves, and work-life balance. So when you think about it, as manager ratings go up, these reasons for leaving go down. Now there's an actual statistical term of an odds ratio that we're working through and trying to give, again, some additional research. But I think it's very telling that the manager ratings are so predictive of all 6 of these categories. And Catherine, I think this gets back to your point in terms of just how inclusive that manager role has become and how many things that they have to do outside of maybe what we've thought about in terms of just traditionally the manager's there to just get the job done. And I think you made a great point when we were talking about this yesterday. I'm sorry. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was saying, do we lose you? You stopped talking.
Oh, yeah, I just was going to let you comment on that because I thought you had a great point yesterday when we were talking about it.
Remind me of my great point.
Sorry.
I've slept since then.
I caught you off guard. I apologize. No, we were just talking about how many things the manager has to do now. That isn't kind of what they traditionally have done. We've thought about that manager as just get the work done, right? That's how we've thought about the manager role. They just need to make sure that the work product is out. And I think what you were pointing out is that the manager is often an individual contributor as well. They have to do both. And that's really what I thought was important.
Right. I mean, I think we're seeing that, especially again, continuing in years being leaner and leaner. It's like, I'm supposed to manage, I'm supposed to develop. I certainly struggle with this myself, but I've got all of this to do just to keep the wheels on the bus some days. And so unfortunately, some of that proactive development often falls to the bottom of the list.
Absolutely. What we also saw is that ratings of employer can predict environment, involuntary, job, manager, and total rewards. I don't want to, it's impossible to get into a ton of detail here. And so I'd invite anyone that wants to talk in more detail about this to give us a call. I'm happy to spend some time going through this data in more detail. What I really want people to take away is that I think there is a lot of undervaluing of exit interviews and being able to do them scientifically correct. And what we're seeing is more and more value in the exit interview because we're able to really track those real reasons for leaving. And now we start to look at these predictive measures and really see the opportunity to have almost a pulsing mechanism for employers to really hold the managers accountable and hold themselves accountable as employers to improving key metrics. Do you see the same thing, Catherine?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So when we think about that, the role of the manager, this is what I really think. I think we've got to make sure that those managers are developed to be good career managers. They got to be able to coach managers through their career. The manager is really the steward of the culture, and so how are they going to really embrace the culture and become that? They've got to work with employees around work-life balance issues and be flexible. Employees really do best when they're working to their strengths. So how are managers going to create jobs and maybe be a little bit flexible in the job creation to make it more applicable to their strengths? And then managers obviously must display a certain level of competency and professionalism. So I think the role of the manager is going to continue to evolve. And I think it's going to have to evolve in order to retain employees effectively. So what did the pandemic teach us about, employee retention? And I really think it boils down to kind of four things. I think employers have really been delaying creating more flexible work arrangements for years. And I think what we saw in the data and what we've seen anecdotally is that organizations are realizing that they can be more flexible, that they can create different work environments, that they can that they can create opportunities for employees to feel more work-life balance. I know from one of our team members that, just talking about the commute and just that 20 or 25-minute commute, taking that out of their day and how much they thought that added to their work-life balance. So I think it's something that we really learned. And the question is, how do we take this and move it forward? And keep all of the positives, and then, what are the negatives that we've got to overcome? And I think a lot of those are around culture and communication. I think managers appeared to step up. Notice I said appeared, I didn't say they did. And we're going to have more data on that. But I think what it really means is, can these efforts be maintained? Whatever it is that's making it positive, we've got to figure out how to maintain that, because if we don't, we're going to see more people leaving. And then work is important and necessary for most, but employees are certainly going to go to great efforts to keep their family members safe and provide the best environment for their loved ones. So I think we have to keep that in mind and understand that all employees are going to have priorities, and we're going to have to make sure that we understand what those priorities are. And lastly, I would just say that, never has listening to employees been more important. I mean, that's what we do every day here at Work Institute. We're literally getting feedback from hundreds and thousands of employees on a daily, weekly, monthly, and annual basis. And there's so much being revealed in that data, so much information being shared by employees. And we've got to make sure that employers are, in fact, listening and making ongoing changes that are necessary. So I know we've run a little long. I appreciate everybody's patience. A lot of you have stuck with us. So if there's any questions, feel free to ask them. I'm going to check the Q&A here. It looks like everybody's been using the chat box. Let's see here. Great comment here from Joseph. He said, we manage work, we lead people, and that is where most managers get it wrong. I couldn't agree more, Joseph. And I think, I just feel like we've often taught, and I've talked about this in the past. I think there's two roles. I think there's a manage role and a lead role. And, leadership requires certain things, and managing the day-to-day work requires certain things. And I just think we're seeing those meld together more and more recently. And we're going to have to make sure that we develop our managers. And that's what we see the most. And I know, Catherine, you can speak to this, but we just see that employers don't invest enough and focus enough on developing their managers into good leaders. Is that a fair statement?
Absolutely. I mean, that's, again, along with career, because it's also those two things are tied together, right? If you're not trained, your manager could be a nice guy who replies to email quickly, but if that manager is also not having those developmental conversations, so the person leaves for career because they think there's not a development opportunity, well, it could have been a fault on the manager who just didn't make sure they knew how to explore opportunities or to support that in that endeavor.
100%. Well, again, we appreciate everybody joining us. Again, my name is Danny Nelms. I'm the president. This is my email address here, and Catherine Holston, who leads our client success team and all of our operations, and there's her email address. We are going to be sending out the slides, and there is a recording of this event. And so for those of you that didn't get to witness it live, hopefully you're seeing this via recording, and we appreciate you doing that. But certainly we are more than happy to talk to anybody about what's going on in your workforce and try and help you understand the things that you need to do to improve retention. So don't hesitate to reach out, and we'll talk to everyone soon. Catherine, thank you so much for joining me. This is always fun. I found that I enjoy these webinars more when you're tag teaming with me. So thanks a lot.
Well, thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
All right. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you so much.